Hey guys, this is Alan, and today I'm going to teach you how to propagate your own Shangri mulberry tree. So let's say you want to grow a Shangri mulberry, and you wanna grow it yourself, because this variety specifically right here, it's not easy to find. Most nurseries don't carry it, and so if you live in an area that most places don't have it, you can buy cuttings online, or if you have a friend that actually has a tree, just like mine right here, you can get a cutting out of it and grow your own mulberry tree. Another thing with the Shangri-La mulberry trees, since it's not that common, the price is always going to be a little higher. So to save yourself some money, you can go ahead and grow your own. So there are two main questions that you have to ask when propagating any type of tree. The first one is going to be, when is the best time to propagate it? And the second one is going to be, what is the best method to use to propagate that tree? Now let's talk about mulberry trees in general, or we can talk about Shangri-La anyway. So Shangri-La mulberry tree is a deciduous tree. That means it drops its leaves in the winter, it goes dormant, it goes to sleep. So the best time to propagate this tree specifically is during the winter time. So you wait until your tree drop all its leaves, and then you can go ahead and make some cuttings. Why is that? I like to ask the whys of everything. And the reason for that is because it allows me to understand better how to do anything in life. So if you know why, you will be more successful doing anything that you set your mind to. So why do you wait until winter time? So let's talk about the tree. When the tree goes into dormancy, what usually happens is it will slow down its energy consumption. So if you make cuttings, just like this one's right here, these cuttings right here are going to stay viable for a lot longer than if you actually took them during the growing season, which is the summer, the spring, even into the fall. So you want to take the cuttings in the winter time, so that way you have time to work with them. Because during the growing season, what's going to happen is the tree is actively growing, and if you take the cuttings, most times they're not going to last as long. So that is the main reason why I wait until winter time to get my cuttings. Another reason for that is, I'm gonna explain that in more details as we go on. When you make your cuttings of the mulberry trees during dormancy, they will not actually shoot any leaves. They're not gonna try to grow because they're dormant. They're not taking up that much energy. During the growing season, what usually happens with most mulberry varieties is you're gonna get your cutting, you're gonna try to root it, and what's gonna happen is it's going to grow. It's gonna grow leaves, it's even gonna grow fruit without any actual roots. So by the time it actually starts growing roots, because it feels like, then the actual cutting itself ran out of energy and it will dry out and not take. Now, is it a requirement? Is it 100% requirement that you have to do this during the winter time? No, it's not, guys. If you do this during the growing season, the only bad thing about it is most of your cuttings are not going to take. Some will, most of them will not. If you want to be successful, especially if you don't have that many cuttings, I recommend you to wait until winter time, just like now. So let's talk about what is the best method to propagate this plant right here. Now this variety specifically, the Shangri-La, it will root very easily from cuttings. You can make cuttings, you can make hundreds of them, and you can root them, and they will root very easily. During the winter time, depending on your ambient temperatures, usually it takes about, I would say, 6 to 10 weeks to completely root. And that's how long you're going to be waiting after you actually make your cuttings. Can you propagate this variety using other methods? Yes, you can. So let's say you have rootstock and you want to graft your Shangri-La onto a different variety. Maybe you have a different variety of mulberry growing into your yard, and then you want to graft another variety to it. Yes, you can do that. The grafting is very easy as well, so you can graft them too. Can you grow a mulberry tree, or this one here, from seeds? Yes, you can. Now, there are some disadvantages of growing your mulberry tree from seeds. The first one is going to be the actual fruit you get from those seedlings may not taste the same as the Shangri-La right here. Shangri-La is a named variety. So what usually happens is when you grow those seedlings, the shape of the tree is going to be different. the taste of the fruits may be different, and you will be waiting a lot longer for your actual mulberry tree to fruit as well. So if you don't want to waste time and you want to guarantee that the fruit tastes just the same as the tree that you ate it from, you want to start your cuttings. You want to propagate your mulberry from cuttings or grafting. So let's go ahead and get started, guys. So now you know when's the best time to propagate them, and you know what's the best method to actually use to propagate your mulberry tree. So as you can see, we just trimmed our mulberry tree right here, and we do this every winter time because I want to keep my tree shorter and I want it bushier because it allows me to reach the fruit a lot easier, and the tree is not going to get that tall. Naturally, Shangri-La mulberries, they do shape themselves with a round canopy naturally without you having to prune them. But I prune them anyway because I don't want it to get that tall. By topping it off, it will make your tree even bushier. So it's personal choice. If you want to be able to walk around your tree, don't do anything, and eventually the tree is going to get taller than you are, and you'll be able to walk around it, and you may get some fruit. But personal choice, I like it shorter and bushier. So we just prune them, and then I don't like wasting anything. I don't like killing trees. So these branches right here are alive. So we're gonna make cuttings out of them, so that way we can find them new homes eventually. So I'm gonna show you right now how to actually make those cuttings. So let's walk over here and I can show you real quick. So the first thing you're gonna need is, when making cuttings, guys, you're going to have, there are 4 different types of cuttings. The first one's gonna be herbaceous, second one's gonna be softwood, then semi-wood, and then hardwood. Now for mulberry trees, personal experience, I've noticed semi-hard and hardwood, it's going to be a lot better than using softwood. Why? I'm not sure, guys. If you have softwood, will they take? Yes, they will. Are your chances of failing a lot higher? Yes, they are. So if you want to stay safe, just get semi-hardwood or hardwood and you'll be safe. Just like this one right here. Now, how do you make cuttings, guys? Now, this is not that complicated. This is just general advice. So just follow this and you'll be successful. So there are a few things you have to keep in mind. How big of cuttings do you want to have? Now, I've noticed, if you look at this one here, this is about the diameter of a pencil. So that's usually about the average size that I make my cuttings. Can you go smaller than that? Or can you go bigger than that, like this one right here? Yes, you can. Now, what I've noticed is, if you go too small, when you make cuttings, you have to understand this. The energy is actually stored inside your cutting. So when making cuttings, it's a race for you cutting to root before it actually runs out of energy. So when you have a smaller cuttings, what usually happens is they will run out of energy. That means it will dry out a lot easier than if you have a little bigger cuttings. Now, if you have too big of a cutting, the opposite is true. The cutting itself, it requires a lot more energy to keep this alive. So sometimes, depending on the ambient temperatures and the actual cuttings themselves, they may run out of energy a lot sooner, so they may dry out on you a lot faster. So just try to stick in the middle. If you go a little smaller, a little bigger, it's fine. Especially if you have a lot of cuttings, you can be selective. If you don't have that many, just use whatever you have, and then it's better than not doing anything at all. Now, there is one main thing to remember. I like my cuttings to be in the middle. The reason why is because if you come look, this right here are what you call nodes. That's where your leaves are gonna grow. Now, since we make cuttings, if we stick those under the potting mix, that's where your root system is actually going to grow out of. So when you have the smaller branches, the nodes are a lot closer together. When you have bigger branches, if you come over here and look closer, your nodes are gonna be farther apart. Now, ideally, when making cuttings, you want at least 2 to 3 nodes to go below the potting mix. Obviously, if your cuttings are gonna be a lot thicker, like this one right here, the nodes are a lot farther apart, so your cuttings are gonna have to be longer to make up for that. If your cuttings are a little smaller, then your nodes are gonna be a lot closer together, so your cuttings don't really have to be that long. Now, so let's go ahead and make a cutting right now. How long do you want your cutting to be? To be honest, it doesn't really matter, guys. Personally, my cuttings are about 12 to 16 inches long. And the reason they are that long is because the bags that we use for our cuttings, they're about 12 inches long. So I try to make my cuttings long enough to fit into the bag. You don't have to use this right here, guys. You can use anything. You can use a bucket. You can use a container like this one right here. You can use anything that holds, you know, dirt or your potting mix. You don't really have to use these baggies. The reason I do these bags is because, for one, it allows me to check the cuttings every once in a while to make sure they're actually rooted or not. It allows me to keep them organized, especially if I have several thousand cuttings growing at one point. So, you know, I can only have so many buckets full of dirt. So this keeps them organized, and it's a lot easier to manage them that way. And when they're fully rooted, I can just take them out of the bags and put them in containers. Now, let's go ahead and make the cutting real quick, guys. So, I have several branches right here. And remember the bags that we're using? I want at least 2 to 3 nodes below the potting mix level. So, and we know my bags are about 12 inches long. So I'm going to go ahead and eyeball this one. When making your cutting, you know your roots are going to grow out of those nodes. So when making your cutting, you want to measure your cutting, and then you want to see where you want to cut. And you want to cut right below a node right there, just like this one. And then you make a cut. And that right there, it's a cutting. You can make hundreds of cuttings just like this one. And as you see my bucket right here, if you want to look right there, you can see we have probably about 100 cuttings in that container. Ready for this season, 2021. Now, what do we do next? The next step after you make your cutting, guys, is to decide what type of potting mix you want to use. We use Vermiculite. Vermiculite we can buy in bulk. It holds some water, but not a lot, and it drains the water very quickly. You can use perlite as well if you want, but you have to make sure your perlite is actually smaller chunks, because if it's too big, it will drain the water too quickly, and it will not retain the moisture as well, especially when your cutting starts rooting out. You want your potting mix to hold some water, but not completely stay soaking wet. There's one thing you're gonna have to keep in mind when choosing your potting mix, and that is to try to steer away from organic potting mixes. You don't want to use compost. You don't want to use dirt. And the reason for that is when your cuttings start rooting out, the root system is very delicate. And if you use organic sources like, let's say, compost, compost has a lot of bacteria in there. It has a lot of fungi. It has a lot of bugs. Those bugs, all those living organisms are great in the ground for older trees. But for your cutting, it's not. What usually is gonna happen, they're gonna contaminate your cutting, they're gonna cause fungus, mold to grow, and it's just not good for your cutting. So you want to keep your potting mix as sterile as possible. Now, let's say you don't have the luxury of buying Vermiculite, or you don't have perlite. It's not a requirement. You can improvise. Let's say you have compost, or let's say you have dirt. It has to drain the water. That is the main ingredient that you have to follow. But as long as you follow that, you can change everything else. So how do you make your potting mix sterile? I'll make another video explaining that in more details, but the easiest way is to get your soil, get your compost, stick it in the oven for 30 minutes at 200 degrees, and that will kill all the pathogens inside that compost or soil, making your soil sterile, so it's clean, so your cutting has a clean, sterile media to grow roots into. Anyways, we have that out of the way. So we have a vermiculite right here. The next step you're gonna do is you're gonna decide what type of container you're going to use. If you're only growing a few cuttings, I'll be right back. You can use a bucket, and then you can just stick everything in a bucket and then put it away. I'll show you in a minute. Just stay here. All right, you see this bucket right here? Those are fixed in there, but you can use the same technique. Let's say you're only doing a few cuttings and you want to stay as simple as possible. You don't want to spend that much money. Just stick your perlite in there, vermiculite. In this bucket specifically, I have a mixture of perlite, but I also have cocoa coir in there to hold some of the moisture in there, because perlite drains the water too quickly, especially this one right here, since the chunks are a little bigger than that I like. And all you gotta do is, you know, use a bucket and put everything in there. Now, the next step you're going to do, guys, is what I like to do personally. I like to expose the cambium layer by scratching the bark just like this, just very quickly, guys. Nothing complicated. You do that, and then the next thing you're going to need is some rooting hormone. So the rooting hormone that we use right here, this is called Dip and Grow. Now, what type of rooting hormone to use? Don't worry about it, guys. You can use anything, whatever you have, it will work. This one here, I like it because you can just buy you can buy this anywhere. It's very cheap, and it will make hundreds of gallons of rooting hormone mixture that you can use for your cuttings. Nothing specifically, nothing special about this. This will not make your roots grow any faster than any other rooting hormone. And the reason for that is because all rooting hormones have the same active ingredient, and that is indole-3 butyric acid. And that is the active ingredient that will actually promote root growth on your cutting. That is an actual hormone that your trees produce naturally, and they usually send that hormone to an area where the tree requires roots. You can buy this one here, or you can buy powder, you can buy a gel, you can buy the liquid form like this one. It doesn't really matter which method you use, they all work about the same. Buy whatever is cheapest and easiest for you to get. Now what I do, I get my mixture in a cup, just like this one right here. You have your cutting, you're gonna scrape it to expose the cambium layer. The cambium layer is just a thin layer underneath the bark. Think of it as a vessel of your plant, like its circulatory system, where it actually moves all the nutrients up and down the tree. So you want to expose that, and then you're gonna stick it in the cup. Now the instructions on this rooting hormone that I use, it says to keep it in there about 3 to 5 seconds, and then you take it and you're gonna shake it up just like this one right here. Now the next thing you do is, depending on the container that you use, if you use a bucket like this one, you're just gonna stick it in there. Remember earlier I told you to keep at least 2 to 3 nodes below the soil minimum, because remember, your roots are actually gonna grow out of those nodes. So the bags that I use are about 12 inches long. So what I do, after I dipped my cutting into the rooting hormone, I just stick my cutting into the bag and I just work it in there slowly all the way down. And usually I stop about 2 inches from the bottom of the bag to allow the roots to grow into that area. And then I pack my potting mix in there, and then the next thing I do, I tie it off. And that is my Shangri cutting. As you can see in this bucket right here, we have about 100 cuttings, and they are all done the same way. And this is exactly how we propagate our Shangri mulberries, and we have been for the past 3 years. We have probably propagated over 1,000 mulberries easily. Now, once you have your cuttings in the bags like this, you have to make sure that your potting mix is not wet, guys. You want it a little moist, but you don't want it to be soaking wet. So I would say in this bag right here, you're probably going to put about maybe 1/4 to 1/2 cup of water. and that will sustain this cutting right here until it fully grows roots completely throughout the bag. And every few weeks you can take it out of the bucket and look at it and see what it looks like. Now let's remember, we're doing this in the winter time. Now what's the next thing you want to do? The next thing you want to do is you want to get your bucket and you're going to bring it in your garage where it's dark but it's not that cold. And what's that going to do is going to warm up the potting mix and it's going to trigger root growth. And usually, since you're doing it during the winter time, your roots are going to come out before you see any new leaves, and that is what you want. After you make your cuttings, if you're doing them in the winter time, it usually takes about, here in Arizona, in my area, it takes about 6 to 10 weeks for them to fully root in these bags. And that is how long you're going to keep them there. Once you see roots everywhere, then at that point you can take your cutting out and you can repot it into a bigger container. But that is exactly how we do Shangri-La cuttings. Let's talk about the issues about propagation. Now, the main issue that we have during the winter time is if your potting mix is not sterile. So let's say you reuse vermiculite or you reuse coco coir or perlite from last season and you forgot to sterilize it by putting it in the oven 200 degrees for 30 minutes. Now that may have some pathogens in there and that will promote fungus to grow in your media. Since this is going to be completely sealed and it's going to be humid in your garage in the darkness, it may grow mold, especially if it's not sterile. You don't want mold in your cutting because that's going to rot everything. Now the second main issue that you have during propagation, just like this, it's going to be fungus gnats. If you bring your container inside the house, the main thing you're going to have are fungus gnats. Fungus gnats look like fruit flies. What they do, they're going to linger around your cuttings and somehow they always find a way. They're going to lay their eggs in your potting mix. The eggs are going to hatch. The larvae, what they do, they actually eat the bark, the actual cambium layer. Remember that little thin layer underneath the bark? They're going to eat that layer off your cutting, killing the cutting in the process. Once you have fungus gnats, it's extremely hard to get rid of them. And that is the main reason why I don't like to use organic potting mixes, because in order for fungus gnats to live, they need organic sources, such as compost, actual dirt. This is vermiculite, and we haven't had any issues with vermiculite, and that's the main reason why we like using this. But like I said, you can use compost if you want, but you have to sterilize it, and you have to keep the fungus gnats away. And that is exactly how you propagate your Shangri-La mulberry, guys. It's not really that complicated. It's very easy. It only takes a few minutes if you're only doing a few cuttings. We're doing a few hundred here, so obviously it's gonna take a few hours because you have to fill up all the bags. You can make it simple and use a bucket. It doesn't really matter how you do it, just do it. Don't be afraid, and you can grow your own plants. It's extremely easy to do. So then the reason we do this is because, for one, I like growing plants. Two, we needed to prune our Shangri-La mulberry over there. And three, I didn't want to waste the plant, you know. So we always propagate even if we don't need it, just because we like growing plants. So, all right, guys, and I think that covers everything. Just to summarize everything, get your cuttings. You can make them as long as you like, you can make them as short as you want. Just make sure you have about 2 to 3 nodes below the soil. Myself personally, I usually have about maybe 5 because of the type of bags or the size of my cuttings. But just make sure you have a few below the soil. You can use some rooting hormone. Doesn't matter what brand you use, they're all about the same. They all have the same active ingredient. So you can go as cheap as you want, as expensive as you want. It doesn't really matter. Now, is rooting hormone a requirement? No, it's not. If you put your cuttings in here without anything else, they will still root. But rooting hormone will actually increase your chances of being successful. If there's anything I can do to be more successful at growing plants, I will do it. And I will tell you about it too, especially if it works. And that is the main reason why I do it. So let's say you don't have access to rooting hormone and you already got your cuttings and you don't want to wait. So just go ahead and do your cuttings. It's fine, guys. So plants root naturally, you know, out there without any help from us. And if they can do it without our help, I'm sure they can do it, you know, in a bag just by you putting it in there. So don't overthink it, just do it. And that's it, guys. So if you have any questions, you can comment below. If you like my videos, you can subscribe. And I will see you next time.